Good evening, pals. On the morning of January 28, 1986, high above the Atlantic, the shuttle's cockpit is filled with a silence that is not empty, but simply listening. Pilot Mike Smith says, "Go at throttle up," and the reply comes back from Commander Dick Scobie, just a calm, professional acknowledgement, the kind exchanged 100 times before a small, steady thread of human routine woven into the cold fabric of that morning. I imagine their eyes on the instruments, the steady hum of the engines under their seats, and the faint crackle of the radio carrying their voices outward into a blue that held them quietly, as if the sky itself was already beginning to forget. And now, here you are. In the quiet of this night, wherever you have chosen to rest, I want you to know that you have found your way to a small, gentle corner of the world, a place we call bedtime and historian. I am glad you are here. I was just sitting here thinking about the cold, about the way the air feels on a winter morning when everything is still and the world seems to be holding its breath. And I thought, perhaps you might like to sit with me for a little while and let the noise of the day fall away piece by piece like snow settling on a branch that has long forgotten the weight of summer. Can you feel it? The place where you are right now, I mean. Not the story, not yet, but the actual space around your body. Maybe you are lying down with your head resting on a pillow that has slowly over the course of the evening begun to take on the exact shape of your tiredness, molding itself to the curve of your neck and the gentle slope of your shoulder. Your blanket, if you have one, might be pulled up close around you, and it holds a warmth that is entirely your own, a small private climate that you have created just by being still, just by breathing. The air in your room, is it cool against your cheek? I often find that the very tip of my nose gets cold first, even when the rest of me is perfectly warm, as if that one small part of me wants to remember what the outside world feels like even while I am safe inside. Take a moment right now to just notice that sensation, the feeling of the air touching your skin wherever it is exposed, a gentle, constant presence that asks nothing of you, expects nothing from you, and simply waits. Outside your window, the world is doing whatever it does at this hour. Perhaps the street is silent, the pavement dark and empty, with a single street lamp casting a pool of amber light that shivers slightly in the breeze. Perhaps there is a distant sound so quiet you can barely hear it, the hum of a faraway road, or the soft rustle of a tree that is also in its own way preparing for sleep. All of that is out there, but it does not need you right now. Right now, you are here with me, and we are going to take a journey together, a very slow one, a journey where the destination is not nearly as important as the gentle winding path we will follow to get there. So, let your breathing settle into a rhythm that feels natural and unhurried, and let your eyelids grow heavy because there is nothing you need to see with your eyes for what I am about to tell you. It will all appear behind them in the soft, dark theater of your own imagination. I want to ask you a quiet question, something to turn over in your mind like a smooth, cool stone found on a beach. Have you ever wondered, and I mean really wondered in that deep, drifting way we wonder about things just before sleep, how a nation that could put a man on the moon, a country that had built machines of such impossible grace and power that they could break the grip of gravity itself, how that same nation could lose 7 of its finest, most brilliant souls, simply because of a winter morning that was a little too cold. It seems, when you think about it that way, like a puzzle with a piece that doesn't quite fit a story that took a turn so unexpected that the mind still, all these years later, struggles to make sense of it. But we are not here tonight to solve puzzles or to find answers or to fix anything that is broken. We are here simply to look quietly and with great care at the shape of that cold morning and to listen, really listen to the voices that were carried on it. If you are still awake, still floating here on the surface of this story with me, I want you to know something. Those of us who have stayed until this point in the night, we are perhaps looking for something similar. A quiet corner, a shared breath, a space where the world does not ask us to be productive or efficient or on time. If you find that here, if this becomes a place where your mind can finally slow its endless circling, then you might let me know sometime in your own way. A small gesture on the screen, you are holding a quiet signal that tells me you are here drifting alongside me in the dark. It is not a command, not a request for a subscription. It is more like a whispered secret between two friends who have found themselves awake at the same improbable hour. You can tell me where you are too if you like your location and the local time, and I will imagine a little map of all of us pinpricks of gentle light scattered across the sleeping globe, all listening to the same quiet story about a very cold morning, a very long time ago. Now, I want you to close your eyes, if they are not closed already, and let the world you can see with them simply dissolve into a soft, velvety darkness. And into that darkness, we are going to paint a new picture, a place that exists now only in memory and in the faded crystalline quality of old photographs. Imagine, if you can, the sky over Florida, not the Florida of beach umbrellas and sunscreen and the lazy, humid heat of a summer afternoon, but the Florida of deep winter of a January that has bitten down hard on the peninsula. The sky on this particular morning, the 28th of January in 1986, is not the soft, hazy blue you might expect. It is a sharp, brittle, almost colorless blue, a sky that seems to have been chilled to its core, the kind of blue that makes your eyes ache just a little to look at it, because there is no moisture, no softness, nothing to filter the raw, piercing light of the sun. This is a crystal clear sky, a sky of absolute, unforgiving clarity. and it stretches from one horizon to the other, like a vast upturned bowl of ice. Below this sky, the ground is covered in a thin, glittering crust of frost. It coats the sawgrass and the palmetto bushes, turning every blade and every frond into a tiny, delicate sculpture of white crystal. The concrete of the launch pad, that immense brutalist structure that rises from the flat Florida landscape, is stained dark with the cold, and from its surface a deep penetrating chill seems to radiate outward, a cold so profound that if you were to touch it with your bare hand, your skin might stick just for a second, as if the concrete itself were reluctant to let you go. The entire complex, normally a place of roaring, earth-shaking power, is strangely silent, wrapped in a muffling blanket of frozen air. The only sound, and I want you to imagine this sound very carefully, letting it fill the quiet space behind your closed eyes. The only sound is a faint, high-pitched cracking, the sound of ice expanding and contracting, groaning softly in the joints of the massive metal structure. It is the sound of the cold itself, speaking in a language of stress and contraction, a language that very few people were listening to on that morning. And from the body of the machine that rests against the launch tower, the Space Shuttle Challenger plumes of white vapor vent from its sides in silent, rhythmic breaths, like a great sleeping beast whose exhalations are instantly frozen by the bitter air. The steam curls and billows, catching the low, slanted light of the winter sun, and then it dissipates, torn apart by a wind that you can almost feel on your own skin. A wind that carries the sharp metallic scent of supercooled machinery mixed with the faint, ghostly aroma of coffee drifting from a thermos left on a console somewhere. Somewhere in the distance, a bird calls out a single, hesitant note, as if it too is confused by the profound cold and is checking to see if any other living thing is awake. There is no answer. Just the soft rhythmic breathing of the shuttle and the distant crackle of ice and the immense empty silence of the sky. I want you to stay in this moment with me for a while, to let it stretch out and fill your awareness completely, because this moment, this frozen, suspended instant before anything happens, is the most important part of the story. This is the quiet heart of it. We are not here to rush toward a climax or a conclusion. We are here to feel the biting cold on our imagined skin, to see the way the sun glints off the frost, to hear the soft, otherworldly groaning of the ice. Let the world of your bedroom fade a little more with every breath. The weight of your body sinking into the mattress becomes the immense grounded weight of the launch pad itself. The sound of the wind outside your window becomes the wind sweeping across the Florida marshlands, a wind that has traveled across the Gulf of Mexico and carries with it the memory of deep, open water. Your own breathing, slow and steady, becomes the vapor venting from the side of the sleeping shuttle, a soft, white, rhythmic cloud against the piercing blue. Perhaps, And this is just my own thought, a quiet opinion I have formed after sitting with this story for many years. Perhaps the disaster was not the single violent moment that everyone remembers, the catastrophic fireflower bloom in the sky. Perhaps the real failure had already happened long before, in the days and months and years of meetings and memos, in the weight of a system that chose schedules over whispered warnings, that listened to the voice of ambition and urgency more closely than it listened to the groaning of ice on a frozen morning. The disaster in that view was not an explosion. It was a quiet, accumulated fracture in human judgment, a decision made again and again in well-lit rooms far from the launch pad, a decision to press forward to meet the timeline, to ignore the simple physical truth that a cold O-ring becomes brittle and loses its ability to seal. The true tragedy was not in the fire, but in the silence that preceded it, a silence filled with all the things that were known but left unsaid. But this thought is like a pebble dropped into a deep, still pond. Let the ripples spread out and then fade away. We will not chase them. We will stay here in the cold with our stiff fingers and the chill radiating from the concrete and the metallic taste of the air. I was just thinking, about the people who were there that morning, not in the shuttle, but on the ground, the ones who had to arrive in the darkness hours before dawn, their breath fogging in the air, their footsteps echoing on frozen metal gantries. They would have been wearing heavy coats and thick gloves, and they would have been moving with a quiet, practiced deliberation, checking panels and tightening bolts, their minds focused on the thousands of tiny critical tasks that stood between this silent sleeping giant and its journey into that vast cold blue. They were the last people to see Challenger whole and silent, the last to touch its cold skin with their gloved hands, the last to hear its strange icy groans before it awoke for the final time. And now, as you lie here with your eyes closed, I want you to imagine that you are one of them just for a moment, but you are not there to work. You are there to simply witness. Stand at the edge of the launch complex, far enough away to be safe, close enough to feel the immensity of the machine and the profound absolute stillness of the morning. The cold air bites at your cheeks, and the tip of your nose is definitely cold now, and you can see the frost sparkling on every surface, millions of tiny frozen stars. The world at this moment is reduced to this: the cold, the silence, and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing, mixing with the venting steam from the shuttle. There is no past and no future. There is only this one singular frozen instant and the feeling of your own smallness, standing before something so much larger than yourself, something built by thousands of hands and millions of hours of thought, now resting quietly under a blanket of ice and waiting for the sun to climb a little higher. Let that image hold you, cradling your tired mind like a hammock, swinging very, very slowly. The blue of the sky is beginning to deepen, just a fraction, the black of space still clinging to its highest reaches. But here, near the ground, the light is growing. The frost will not last much longer. The ice will begin to melt, the bonds of the cold loosening their grip, the machine warming as its own internal systems stir to life. But that is still to come. Right now, everything is held in perfect crystalline suspension. The silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat, a soft and distant drum, the only measure of time in a world that has, for this fleeting moment, forgotten how to rush. So stay here with me in the quiet, in the cold, and let everything else simply fall away. This is the beginning of the story, the very beginning, and we have all the time in the world. I will sit here a little longer, and if you want me to continue, you know what to do. Let's drift back there together, you and I, to a morning in a small town somewhere in the very center of America in the early 1980s. The kind of morning where the sky is a pale washed blue and the air is already warm before 9 o'clock, carrying the faint, sweet smell of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of a lawnmower a few streets over. That steady, unhurried note that feels like the day itself is taking a slow, deep breath. You are standing on a quiet suburban sidewalk, and everything around you feels solid and new and profoundly optimistic. A station wagon, maybe a wood-paneled one, is parked in a driveway, and its owner, a man in a short-sleeved shirt and glasses the shade of dark tortoiseshell, is washing it with a soft, sudsy sponge, moving in slow, lazy circles, the kind of motion that has no hurry in it at all. He looks up at the sky, not searching for anything in particular, not anxious, but simply because the day is so clear and so full of a quiet, humming possibility. And perhaps, I think, because somewhere inside him, he knows the sky is no longer just a dome of weather. It's a place we can go now, almost as easily as we might drive to the next town. An airplane is crossing overhead, a silver needle leaving a thin white scar across the blue, and he watches it for a moment, this ordinary miracle of metal and engineering, and he doesn't think about the physics that keeps it aloft, or the intricate ballet of air traffic control guiding its path. He doesn't need to. He just thinks it's a beautiful day to fly somewhere, and then he returns to the slow rhythmic work of washing his car, the water beading on the waxed hood like tiny perfect lenses that catch the morning light and hold it for a heartbeat before sliding away. That feeling, that easy, unspoken confidence in the machines we built was like a soft blanket draped over the entire country. You could feel it, I think, even if you didn't have a name for it. You could see it everywhere you looked. The glossy pages of magazines, the kind with paper so smooth and thick, it felt almost cool to the touch, were filled with artists' renderings of gleaming space stations, their solar panels spread like the wings of a metallic dragonfly. And beside them, young people in crisp one-piece flight suits, smiling with the relaxed confidence of those who knew the future was a friendly, accessible place, not a cold and distant frontier. And the sound of a shuttle launch, that earth-shaking, chest-thumping roar that started as a low, crackling rumble and built into a sustained, thunderous crescendo. It was becoming as familiar as the evening news theme or the jingle from a popular commercial, a sound that once made people stop and hold their breath, but was now somehow simply a part of the soundscape of a Tuesday morning. You might hear it on a radio left playing on a kitchen counter while you poured a second cup of coffee, and you wouldn't even turn up the volume. You'd just stir in the sugar slowly, the deep vibration of it, a background texture to your own quiet, ordinary life. A kind of gentle reminder that out there in the unthinkable distance, someone was doing something extraordinary while you yawned and checked the time. The machine itself, I always thought there was something almost impossibly graceful about it, a creature of contradictions that somehow made perfect sense when you saw it all put together. It was an engineering marvel, that's what they called it, and the words don't even come close. Picture it on the launch pad, not as a trembling, urgent beast straining to escape the earth, but as a quiet monument to human patience. The shuttle itself, a delta-winged glider the size of a small commercial airliner, clung to the side of a massive, rust-colored external fuel tank, and the whole assembly was flanked by two slender white solid rocket boosters that looked from a distance like elegant fluted columns holding up a temple roof, a stillness before a storm that had become so well rehearsed it almost seemed safe. There was a smoothness to it, a kind of deliberate sculptural calm that I suppose whispered to something deep inside us that everything was under control, that the fiery chaos of leaving the planet had been tamed into a careful, repeatable procedure. And then there were the tiles. I always found myself thinking about those tiles, returning to them again and again, like a small, quiet fascination. Each one was individually numbered and handcrafted, made of a high-tech silica material so insulative you could heat one end with a blowtorch and touch the other with your bare hand a second later without feeling a thing. It seems almost impossible, doesn't it? Thousands upon thousands of them, each cut to a unique shape, each fitted into its own specific designated place on the shuttle's belly and nose, like the scales of a gentle, heat-proof fish that had to be perfect every single time. This extraordinary, meticulous, fragile skin seemed to promise something deeply reassuring, that even the most delicate things could be mastered, that you could hold fire in the palm of your hand and not be burned, that the violent, roaring chaos of re-entry could be tamed by a carefully crafted layer of quiet, patient ceramic. I remember thinking, perhaps naively, that if we could build something so painstaking, so lovingly exact, then we must know exactly what we were doing. The smooth metal of the orbiter's skin, cool to the touch, even under the Florida sun, felt permanent, solid, inevitable, like a sculpture carved not from fragile alloys, but from the very idea of progress. And that idea, once you held it in your mind, was hard to let go of. And so the flights began, and they went up and they came back, and the sleek, white and black spacecraft looking a little more worn. After each journey, its tiles scorched and streaked with the dark signatures of its travels would glide down to a runway in the California desert or the flat marshy expanse of Florida. The landing was an almost silent affair compared to the launch, a long, shallow, unpowered glide that ended with a puff of tire smoke on a hot runway and a gentle turn onto the taxiway, as if the whole thing had been nothing more than a slightly dramatic arrival at a very exclusive airport. I want you to stand there in your mind on that tarmac, the balmy Florida sun pressing warmly on your shoulders and the back of your neck, the smell of fresh asphalt, and a faint, lingering tang of some chemical propellant mixing with the buttery scent of popcorn from a nearby concession stand. It's a very particular smell that makes one you don't forget, but also don't find strange anymore. The crowd, a gathering of engineers in short-sleeved white shirts and families with children holding small plastic shuttle models, applauds politely, warmly, but it is not the ecstatic, tearful roar of an earlier era. It is the satisfied, knowing applause of people who have just watched a particularly impressive commercial flight land right on schedule. And if you listen closely, you can already hear conversations about where to eat dinner and whether the traffic on the way home will be bad. The astronauts descend the steps, smiling, looking a little tired, just like any other long-haul passengers arriving at their gate. And then they are whisked away, and soon, if you turn your head, people are already checking their watches, thinking about the drive back to Orlando, about the ordinary details of a day that once would have felt like a chapter torn from science fiction. What happens to a miracle when you see it so often it becomes familiar? This is the quiet, almost invisible threshold we crossed without noticing, and I'm not entirely sure anyone could have pointed to the exact moment it happened. I think perhaps that the slow fade of public wonder is a quieter, more subtle process than we imagine. That first launch had been a spectacle, a shared national intake of breath, the kind of event where time itself seemed to stop, where strangers on a street corner would gather around a shop window just to watch a small flickering television screen and feel collectively the heavy, beautiful pull of the impossible becoming real. You remember it, or perhaps your parents do, the whole world holding its breath as the countdown reached 0, and the very ground seemed to crack with the power of human ambition, a crack that went through your bones and reminded you that you were alive in an extraordinary time. But the fifth launch, that's a news bulletin you watch while finishing your breakfast, the spoon pausing halfway to your mouth and then moving again, because you've already seen this before. The 10th is a brief 60-second segment squeezed between a commercial for a new kind of laundry detergent and the local weather forecast, and the anchor might even make a small joke about it, a gentle, affectionate quip, as if a spaceship were no more remarkable than a reliable family sedan that always starts on the first try. Space seemed conquered, and when something is conquered, it no longer feels dangerous. The feeling is not arrogance, not exactly. It's a softer, more human thing, a quiet, comfortable assumption that we have simply added orbit to the list of places we can safely go, like Chicago or Denver, only with a slightly better view and a lot more silence on the way there. The astronauts, too, began to seem less like demigods carved from marble and more like particularly competent, exceptionally trained pilots, the kind of person you might trust to fly you through a little turbulence without ever losing their calm, steady smile. You can see them in your mind's eye, their faces on the covers of magazines, standing in front of their T-38 training jets, exuding a kind of relaxed professionalism. And you think, this is a person who treats leaving the Earth as a day job, a job they love certainly, but a job nonetheless with checklists and coffee breaks and jokes told in hallways just like any other. The whisper of danger, that cold, prickling sensation at the back of the neck that signals a brush with the absolute unknown. It slowly, softly dissolved into the warm, optimistic, balmy air of a Florida afternoon, and the roar of engines became almost a lullaby, a sound that told you without words that everything was exactly as it should be, and that the future was a place of routine wonder, arriving on time every time, like the most reliable of all the machines we had ever dreamed of making. And, you know, for a little while, that felt like the truest thing in the world. I suppose, looking back, that it was a kind of shared dream we all agreed to believe in, because the alternative was too uncomfortable to hold in your mind for long, and so we let it go gently, like a balloon slipping from a child's hand on a summer evening, rising into the deepening blue, until it was just another star we couldn't quite see anymore. I want you to imagine for a moment a very specific kind of light. The light of a winter morning in a packed school auditorium, where the windows are high and narrow, and the radiators are working too hard, filling the air with that dry metallic warmth that makes children sleepy before the first bell even rings. You know that light, perhaps, the way it slants down through motes of chalk dust, turning everything slightly golden, slightly hazy, as if the whole room is holding its breath under a thin veil of nostalgia for a moment that hasn't even happened yet. And in that light, you can see them. Hundreds of kids cross-legged on a wooden floor that smells of wax and old paper, their faces tilted up toward a television set that has been wheeled in on a tall, wobbly cart, its screen flickering with the pale blue of a Florida sky they have only ever seen in postcards. The hum of the monitor is a low, steady note beneath the chatter, a sound that feels somehow like the inside of a seashell held to your ear, a distant ocean of static and possibility. I think if you were there, you might have noticed how some of the children are gripping the edges of their desks without realizing it, their small knuckles pale, their breath shallow, not from fear, but from a kind of anticipation so pure it almost hums in the air like a plucked string. You see, NASA had done something extraordinary in those years, something that seems, looking back, almost impossibly hopeful. They had decided to send an ordinary person into space. Not a test pilot with ice in his veins, not a physicist who had spent a decade calculating orbital mechanics, but a teacher, a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who wore corduroy skirts and carried a battered leather briefcase and believed with every fiber of her being that space belonged to everyone. Her name was Christa McAuliffe, and I want you to picture her for a moment. Not as a figure in a history book, not as a name on a memorial plaque, but as she was in those final weeks before the launch, when she was simply herself. She had this smile, a smile that seemed to start somewhere deep in her chest and radiate outward until it reached her eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that made you feel, even through a television screen, that she was smiling directly at you, that you were the one person in the world she had been waiting to meet. Her hair was brown and curly, a little untamed, the kind of hair that never quite does what you want it to do. And she laughed easily, a warm musical sound that made the NASA technicians, those serious men with their clipboards and their headsets, look up from their consoles and grin, despite themselves. She was selected, you see, from over 11,000 applicants, a constellation of ordinary dreams, all those letters and applications pouring into NASA from every corner of the country, from chemistry teachers in Nebraska and physics teachers in Oregon and biology teachers in Mississippi, each one of them hoping to be the one who would stand in front of a camera floating in zero gravity and say to the children of America, "Look, this is what is possible." And Christa wrote her application essay in her kitchen, I imagine, late at night, after grading papers, a cup of cold coffee at her elbow, the words coming out in a rush because she believed them so completely. She wanted, she said, to make space real for her students, to take the abstractions in their textbooks and give them breath and weight and texture, to show them that the universe was not a distant, cold, unreachable place, but a classroom without walls, a field trip that never had to end. And when the letter came, when NASA chose her, she cried. Not because she was afraid, but because she thought of her students, of their faces, when they learned that their teacher, their Mrs. McAuliffe, was going to touch the stars. The training for the teacher in space mission was, in its own quiet way, a kind of poetry. You can picture her there at the Johnson Space Center, can't you? Walking down the long white corridors in her blue flight suit, the fabric still stiff and new, making a soft swishing sound with every step she took. The suit had her name embroidered on the chest in red thread, and she would sometimes run her fingers over the letters absent-mindedly during briefings, as if she needed the tactile proof that this was real, that she was not dreaming, that a high school teacher really was about to ride a rocket into orbit. The other astronauts, the professionals, the veterans who had spent years preparing for this exact mission, they treated her with a gentle, almost protective affection, showing her how to eat from the silver pouches of space food, how to strap herself into the simulator seat, how to breathe slowly and deeply when the G-forces pressed down on her chest like a heavy, invisible hand. And she took notes always in a small spiral notebook that she kept in the pocket of her flight suit, jotting down observations and questions and things she wanted to remember to tell her students, because even in the middle of the most extraordinary experience a human being could have, she was still at her core a teacher. I want you to see now the crew of 7, the full complement of Flight STS-51L, the mission that would carry the expectations of a generation on its shoulders, though, of course, they did not think of it that way, not in those precise, weighty terms. They were simply 7 human beings in a small room, drinking coffee from styrofoam cups and making jokes about the weather and checking their equipment one last time before the long walk to the launch pad. You can see them, can't you, in their matching blue suits, a small, brave tribe of explorers on the edge of something vast and unknowable. There was Commander Dick Scobie with his quiet, steady hands and his voice like a calm river, a man who had waited his whole life for this moment and who radiated, without ever saying a word, the kind of competence that made everyone around him breathe a little easier. There was Michael Smith, the pilot, who could fly anything with wings, and who had a way of squinting at the horizon as if he could see already the curve of the earth falling away beneath him. There was Judith Resnick, an electrical engineer with dark, intelligent eyes and a laugh that could fill a room, who had once played piano for her fellow astronauts in the crew quarters, filling the sterile air with something tender and human and fleeting. There was Ronald McNair, a physicist who had grown up in a small South Carolina town where the library had been closed to black patrons, and who had gone on to become one of the most brilliant minds NASA had ever known, a man who carried his saxophone with him everywhere because he believed, I think, that music was just another kind of mathematics, a universal language that could bridge any distance. There was Ellison Onizuka, an Air Force test pilot from Hawaii, who had dreamed of space as a boy, lying on his back in a field of volcanic rock, staring up at the stars and promising himself that one day he would reach them. And there was Gregory Jarvis, an engineer with a gentle, thoughtful face, who had been waiting for his chance to fly for years and who approached every task, no matter how small, with a kind of meticulous, unhurried grace. And then, of course, there was Christa, standing among them, her smile undimmed, her eyes bright with the reflection of something that was not yet visible, but that she could feel somehow just beyond the edge of the known world. The photographers captured them all together, a family portrait of strangers bound by a single shared thread of longing. And if you look at those pictures now, you will notice something peculiar, a softness at the edges, a blurring of the light, as if the cameras themselves understood that this was a moment too fragile to hold with perfect clarity. The morning of the launch, I want you to picture the children again, millions of them scattered across the continent in classrooms and auditoriums and gymnasiums, their teachers having wheeled in the same tall, wobbly television carts, their faces illuminated by the same flickering blue glow. In Concord, New Hampshire, the students of Christa McAuliffe were gathered together, and you can imagine the particular silence in that room, the way the ordinary sounds of a school day had been replaced by something deeper, something closer to reverence. Some of them were holding hands, I think, though they would not have admitted it later. Their fingers intertwined under desks, their knuckles pressing together a small secret chain of human connection against the immensity of what they were about to witness. The television showed the launch pad, the shuttle gleaming white against a sky so clear and blue it looked painted, and the commentator's voice was a low, steady murmur describing the countdown procedures with a practiced, almost hypnotic calm. And then on the screen, they saw her, Christa, walking across the gantry, turning for just a moment to wave at the cameras. Her hand raised her smile so bright it seemed even through the grainy resolution of a classroom television to fill the entire room with a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the overworked radiators and everything to do with hope. That wave, you know, that simple human gesture, it lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but I want you to imagine it now in slow motion, stretching the moment out like a thread of taffy pulled thin and translucent under a summer sun. Her arm rises, the blue fabric of her sleeve catching the early morning light and holding it briefly like a promise. Her fingers are slightly spread, the way a person waves to someone they love at a train station, not a formal salute, but an intimate personal farewell, as if she were saying goodbye to each individual person, watching one at a time. Her head turns just a little, and you can see the curl of her hair, that untamed curl escaping from under her helmet, and her eyes, those eyes that had looked at 1,000 high school students over the years and seen in every single one of them a spark of something infinite. There is no fear in her face, no hesitation, no shadow of doubt, only a joy so complete, so luminous, that it seems in that frozen moment to transcend the photograph, to reach out across decades and touch you wherever you are, whatever time it is, with a gentle, quiet reminder of what it looks like to be fully, unreservedly alive. And the children in the auditoriums, the millions of children, they watched that wave, and they felt, I believe, something shift inside them. Not a dramatic, life-changing epiphany, but a soft, subtle rearrangement of their understanding of the world, like a puzzle piece clicking gently into place. They saw a teacher, an ordinary woman, with an extraordinary smile, walking into a spaceship the way they walked into their classrooms every morning, and for one brief, shimmering moment, the distance between the Earth and the stars seemed to collapse entirely. Space was no longer an abstraction in a textbook, a diagram of planets and orbits and incomprehensible distances. It was a place where Mrs. McAuliffe was going a place where she would float and laugh and teach a lesson that would be broadcast live to every school in the nation. Her voice crackling through the speakers saying, "Look, I made it, and so can you." You can almost smell that morning, can't you? If you close your eyes and let yourself drift backward. The faint, astringent scent of pencil shavings from the sharpener mounted on the wall, the lingering ghost of yesterday's cafeteria lunch, the particular, indefinable smell of a room filled with children who had dressed hurriedly, pulling on sweaters and coats against the January chill, their hair still damp from the morning's rushed showers. The air was warm, almost too warm, the kind of indoor heat that makes your eyelids heavy and your thoughts slow, and the hum of the television was a lullaby, steady and reassuring, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to promise without words that everything was fine, that this was just another launch, that the routine wonder of space flight would continue unbroken into the future. And perhaps, somewhere in the back of your mind, you noticed the small, ordinary details that history would later make significant. The way a particular child's hand gripped the edge of a wooden desk so tightly that the grain of the wood left a faint pattern on their palm. The way a teacher at the back of the auditorium dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. The way the light from the television flickered and shifted across the upturned faces of the children like sunlight on the surface of a slow-moving river. The shuttle itself, that gleaming white machine, sat on the launch pad in the clear Florida morning, and if you had been standing there, I think you might have felt the heat rising from the tarmac in gentle waves shimmering the air, until the whole scene took on the quality of a dream. The interior of the crew cabin was small, but not claustrophobic. Intimate, really, like the inside of a well-loved car on a long family road trip. The seats close together, the instruments glowing with a soft amber light. It smelled, according to the astronauts who had flown before, of new plastic and metal and something faintly electrical, a clean, sterile scent that was not unpleasant, simply unfamiliar, the smell of a place where human beings had not yet left their mark. And in that small, intimate space, the 7 crew members settled into their seats, their harnesses clicking into place with a satisfying mechanical sound, their voices calm and steady over the intercom, running through checklists and confirming readings, and waiting with a patience that must have felt, after all those years of training, almost holy. You know, I always thought there was something beautiful about the way astronauts spoke to each other in those final minutes before a launch. A quiet, economical language stripped of anything unnecessary, every word carrying its full weight and no more. They did not make grand speeches, did not reflect on the significance of their mission or the fragility of human existence. They simply did their jobs, their voices overlapping in a careful choreographed dance of technical precision. And beneath that precision, if you listened closely, you could hear something else, something softer, a current of affection and trust that ran like a hidden river through every syllable. Christa's voice was among them, clear and bright, asking questions in that eager, curious way of hers, and the other astronauts answered her with a warmth that spoke without ever saying it, directly of the deep, unspoken bond that had formed among them in the months leading up to this single, irreplaceable moment. I want you to hold that image in your mind for a little while longer. The 7 of them, in their blue suits, the amber glow of the instruments, the soft hum of the systems powering up around them, and Christa's smile, still bright, still radiant, a small sun burning in the cabin of a spaceship that would carry the dreams of a generation into the cold, quiet vastness beyond the sky. It is an image of hope, pure and uncomplicated, the kind of hope that children understand instinctively, the kind of hope that makes you grip the edge of your desk without realizing it. Your breath held your heart beating a little faster, not from fear, but from the sheer overwhelming beauty of watching someone reach for the impossible and believe with every fiber of their being that they will grasp it. And in that moment, suspended in the warm, golden light of a winter morning, the future stretched out ahead of them like an open road unbounded and bright, waiting to be traveled. I want you to look away from the sky now, to turn your gaze downward, away from the bright Florida morning and the white ship waiting on the launch pad, and step instead into a room that smells of dust and old coffee and the faint metallic tang of ink from a drafting machine that has been running all night. This room is somewhere in Utah, or perhaps it was Utah. I'm not quite sure of the exact building anymore, but it doesn't matter, because the room exists now in a kind of eternal present, a moment frozen in the amber of memory, where a group of engineers sat around a long table scattered with blueprints and stared at drawings that showed something none of them wanted to see. The blueprints are beautiful in their own quiet way. Fine white lines on a deep blue background curling at the edges from being handled too many times, marked here and there with notations in careful, cramped handwriting, the kind of handwriting that belongs to people who have spent their entire careers thinking about tolerances and stresses and the tiny invisible margins that separate safety from catastrophe. And what the blueprints show, if you trace your finger along the lines, is something enormous. The solid rocket boosters, the twin white pillars that would be strapped to the sides of the shuttle like the arms of a giant holding a precious, fragile jewel in its hands. You can see them in your mind, I think. These colossal cylinders so vast that they had to be fabricated in segments, because no factory on Earth could cast them in a single piece. No railway car could transport them whole. No road could bear their weight if they were not broken down into manageable sections and then assembled like some ancient obelisk, being raised piece by piece right there on the launch pad in Florida. Each segment was a ring of steel and propellant taller than a house and wider than the span of your arms stretched out. And when the segments were stacked one on top of another, they formed a tower of controlled fire, a machine designed to contain an explosion and direct it downward, channeling millions of pounds of thrust through a nozzle at the base, pushing the shuttle up and up until it escaped the grip of the Earth entirely. But between the segments, there had to be a seal, because the hot gases inside the booster, the inferno of burning propellant, would search for any weakness, any gap, any microscopic path to the outside world, and if they found one, the seal would fail. The seal was a ring of rubber, two rings actually, a primary and a secondary nested in a groove between the steel walls of each joint, designed to compress when the booster ignited, to swell and fill the gap and hold back the fire. You know, I always thought there was something almost humble about the O-ring. a band of synthetic rubber no thicker than a pencil, sitting quietly in its groove, invisible from the outside, performing a task that most people would never know existed, a tiny, unglamorous component that carried the weight of 7 human lives on its thin black shoulders. The engineer who designed it understood rubber, the way it yields under pressure, the way it springs back when the pressure is released, the way it flows into cracks and crevices like a liquid that has chosen to be solid, conforming to the shape of whatever gap it is asked to seal, obedient and faithful and forgiving. But rubber has a secret, a vulnerability that anyone who has ever stretched a rubber band on a winter morning already knows in their bones. When the temperature drops, rubber changes, it stiffens, it loses that soft, yielding quality. It becomes hard and brittle and slow to respond. Imagine, if you will, holding a rubber band in your hand on a warm summer afternoon. You can stretch it easily, feel it give under your fingers, watch it snap back into shape the moment you release it, elastic and alive and eager to do exactly what you ask of it. Now imagine that same rubber band left outside overnight in the bitter cold of a northern winter. When you pick it up in the morning, it feels different. It feels stiff and unyielding, and if you try to stretch it, it will not flow smoothly. It will resist, and perhaps if the cold is deep enough and the demand is great enough, it will simply break. The O-ring was a seal of faith, not of physics, and faith can be brittle. This is not a metaphor. It is simply the nature of the material. And the nature of the material was known, documented, discussed in meetings that stretched late into the evening in conference rooms at a company called Morton Thiokol, where the engineers had been watching their O-rings very carefully for a very long time. They had seen things that troubled them on previous flights when the boosters were recovered from the ocean and taken apart for inspection. The O-rings showed signs of erosion, tiny black scorch marks where hot gases had bitten into the rubber, eating away a fraction of a millimeter here, a sliver of material there. It was not catastrophic, not yet, but it was a warning, written in the language of soot and char, a message that said quite clearly the seal is not holding perfectly. The fire is finding its way past the first line of defense. And one day, if the conditions are wrong, if the alignment is imperfect, if the cold makes the rubber stiff and slow, one day the fire will find a path all the way through. I want you to picture one of those recovered boosters now in the slow motion clarity of a memory replayed endlessly in the minds of the engineers who saw it. The massive steel cylinder lying on its side in a hangar, the joint opened up for inspection, the technicians leaning in close with flashlights and magnifying glasses, and there on the surface of the primary O-ring, a small blackened groove, a channel cut by a jet of gas so hot and so focused that it sliced through the rubber like a laser through paper. It was only a few centimeters long, barely visible to the naked eye, a tiny scar on a component that was supposed to be pristine. And you can imagine, I think, the quiet way someone might set down a pen, the slow silencing of the room as the realization spread that something fundamental was wrong, that the seal they had trusted was not as trustworthy as they had believed. They wrote reports. Of course they wrote reports, pages and pages of careful analysis charts and diagrams and technical memos that described the erosion in precise measured language, that recommended further study, that warned in the cautious dialect of corporate engineering that the trend was concerning, that the margin of safety was narrowing, that the cold temperatures expected on the night before the launch might possibly be a problem. The engineer hesitated before signing off, but the clock did not hesitate back. And the reports circulated, and meetings were held, and the same evidence was presented again and again, and somewhere along the way, in the long chain of decisions that stretches from the drafting table to the launch pad, the warnings were heard but not heeded, acknowledged but not acted upon, because the flights had succeeded despite the erosion, because the schedule was tight, because the pressure to launch was immense, because human beings have an extraordinary capacity to normalize the abnormal, to grow comfortable with danger when it does not immediately harm them, to mistake luck for design and coincidence for proof. This is the quiet tragedy that unfolded long before the morning of the launch. Not a sudden explosion of flame, not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, incremental surrender, a gradual acceptance that the thing everyone had feared was somehow miraculously not going to happen, even though all the evidence said it would. A slow bomb had already been set by habit. The blueprints on the table in that dusty engineering office did not change. The fine white lines still showed the O-rings in their grooves, still described the specifications that had been written years before, still promised that the seal would hold if the temperature stayed within the tested range. But the temperature was not going to stay within the tested range, because a cold front was moving down across the Florida peninsula that evening, and the mercury in the thermometers was already beginning to fall, and the engineers in Utah, staring at their blueprints and their erosion charts, were beginning to understand that the launch, if it proceeded, would be taking place in conditions that no O-ring had ever been tested, for conditions that the very nature of the material was not designed to withstand. You can almost feel the cold yourself now if you let your imagination drift back to that night. Not the cold of the meeting room, which was kept warm by the building's heating system and the body heat of the gathered engineers, and the old coffee machine that gurgled and hissed in the corner, but the cold outside, the cold creeping down across the great basin, sliding over the mountains and settling into the valleys, the cold that would wrap itself around the steel segments of the boosters stacked on the launch pad in Florida, seeping into the joints, stealing the warmth from the rubber, making it stiff, making it slow, making it brittle. The O-rings waited in their grooves, hidden from view, performing their quiet, invisible duty, and the cold seeped deeper, degree by degree, until the rubber was no longer soft and yielding, until it was hard and unresponsive, until the simple mechanical property that the entire design depended upon had been taken away by the implacable physics of a winter night in the subtropics. A kind of cold that South Florida rarely sees, a cold that was for those rubber rings. The difference between a seal and a gap, between containment and release, between a morning of triumph and a morning of smoke spreading across an empty blue sky. The cold came down from the north that night, slipping across the Georgia line and spilling into the Florida peninsula like a slow, invisible tide. By the time the stars came out over the Kennedy Space Center, the mercury had already fallen far below anything the citrus growers had hoped for, anything the weather reports had predicted just a few days earlier. And the launch pad, standing in its own circle of floodlights, began to grow its strange winter garden. Icicles hung from the steel beams of the fixed service structure, some of them thin and needle-like, others thick and gnarled, and the longest ones, they were 2 feet long, hanging like glass warnings from the tower. They caught the light in cold blue-white glints every time the wind nudged them just enough to sway, and you could almost hear them in the stillness, a faint crystalline tap against the metal like tiny bells that no one wanted to ring. You can picture them there on that night of January 27th, 1986, if you let your mind drift back slowly. Not to the roar of engines that would come later, but to this quiet, frozen moment when the whole complex seemed to be holding its breath. The sky felt more like a Midwestern January than the subtropics of Florida, and the shuttle stood out there too sealed and silent, its white frost-covered windows staring out at nothing. Its massive boosters were wrapped in a chill that could not let go, and even the floodlights seemed to huddle closer, their glow hard and metallic against the cold. The air smelled of cold metal and something faintly electric, the ozone tang that always seems to hang around heavy machinery. And if you had been standing there, though, no one was not at that hour, not in that cold, you might have heard only the low hum of the heaters that had been brought in to keep certain components from freezing solid. They hummed and clicked on and off in a rhythm that was almost like a lullaby for the sleeping giant on the pad, a soft mechanical whisper that asked nothing and promised nothing. But the heaters could not reach inside the joints of the solid rocket boosters. They could not warm the hidden O-rings that sat in their grooves like small, trusting creatures waiting for a warmth that would never come. And the cold seeped deeper, with each passing hour, degree by degree, until the rubber itself became something harder, slower, a material that had forgotten how to spring back, how to seal, how to do the one simple thing it was meant to do. A few hundred miles away in a conference room at the Morton Thiokol plant in Utah, the engineers were still awake. The coffee that had been poured hours ago had gone cold in its cups, and the air in the room was thick with the kind of nervous sweat that comes not from physical exertion, but from the slow, grinding pressure of knowing something you wish you didn't know. Roger Boisioli leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, and if you let yourself look at him now, through the soft lens of memory, you could see the slight tremor in his fingers. The way his jaw was set too tight. The way his voice, when he spoke, carried a weight that seemed to press down on the whole room, not with anger, but with something far more difficult to ignore. The quiet, desperate certainty of a man who had seen the data and could not unsee it. "I think we are making a mistake," he said, and the words hung in the air of that conference room. They were not loud, not dramatic, just a simple sentence that somehow contained more fear than any shouted warning ever could, because it was not a prediction of some distant possibility. It was a recognition of what was already happening right now inside the cold joints of the boosters stacked on the pad in Florida. The teleconference line was open. On the other end, in Alabama and Florida and Texas, the NASA managers listened or pretended to listen, and the static on the line was like a thin gray curtain between what the engineers were trying to say and what the managers were willing to hear. A crackling, intermittent barrier that seemed to eat the most important words to blur the sharp edges of the data, to turn a desperate plea into something that sounded to ears that did not want to understand, almost reasonable, almost negotiable. Boisioli had shown them the charts, the photographs of earlier flights where the O-rings had eroded the graphs that plotted temperature against resilience, and the line on those graphs dropped off a cliff somewhere down in the cold region where no O-ring had ever been asked to perform. A region that they were right now proposing to enter for the very first time. Without a test, without a backup, without any proof that the thing would hold. And the silence that followed his case was a long, slow thing. A pause that seemed to stretch out and fill the room and the telephone line and the whole dark night between Utah and Florida. A silence that was not empty, but full of everything that had been said and everything that could not be unsaid, full of the implications that no one wanted to speak aloud, but that were there nonetheless, sitting in the center of that conference table like a stone that everyone could see, but no one would pick up. You know that kind of silence, I think. The kind that happens when something important has been laid bare, and everyone in the room understands it, but no one knows how to proceed and how to be the first one to say, "Yes, you're right, we must stop." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a steady, high-pitched note that seemed to grow louder as the seconds ticked by. The coffee maker in the corner gurgled once, twice, as if trying to fill the void. And someone, maybe it was Bob Lund, the vice president of engineering, shifted in his chair, the sound of fabric against fabric unexpectedly loud in that suspended moment. Still, nobody spoke the words that would halt the launch, would ground the shuttle, would send everyone home to wait for a warmer day. Because stopping was not just a technical decision, you see. It was a political one, a financial one, a decision that would ripple outward into the press conferences and the congressional hearings and the endless scrutiny that NASA was already feeling. The pressure to perform, to deliver, to prove that the space program was worth every dollar, every headline, every school child's dream it had been building for years, and it sat in that room like a second invisible presence, a kind of gravity that bent everything toward forward motion. And then the voice came from the other end of the line. A voice that belonged to a manager whose name has been recorded in the history books, but who in this moment was just another tired man at the end of a long day. A man who had a schedule to keep and a mission to fly and 1,000 other concerns that had nothing to do with the temperature of a piece of rubber he had never seen. The words when they came were not shouted, not angry, just weary, a little impatient, wrapped in the language of practicality and realism and all the things that sound reasonable when you are not the one who has to stand in a conference room and say with absolute certainty that something terrible might happen if you proceed. "When do you want me to launch?" the voice said. And then after a pause, that was not a hesitation but a kind of rhetorical point. In April, and the silence that followed that question was a different kind of silence. A silence not about uncertainty, but about power. About the way a simple question can reframe an entire argument, can make caution sound like obstruction, can make the lonely voice of the engineer seem like nothing more than a headache, a delay, an inconvenience that the machinery of progress would not afford. Larry Malloy, another name that history would remember, leaned into his microphone and said, "My God, Theocol, when do you want me to launch next April?" And the engineers on the other end of the line heard those words and understood, perhaps in that instant, that the decision had already been made. That the room in Alabama had already decided what it wanted to hear and was now only waiting for the formalities, for the ritual of objection to be concluded so that the real work could continue. Roger Boisjoli, sitting in that Utah conference room with his cold coffee and his data sheets and his photographs of eroded O-rings, must have felt something in that moment that you and I can only guess at. A kind of hollowing out. A sense of being very small and very far away and very, very certain that what was happening was wrong, but also somehow inevitable. Because the system was not designed to listen to the quiet voices, no matter how right they were, no matter how much evidence they brought, no matter how much they pleaded into the crackling static of a teleconference line late at night. Behind him, one of the data sheets sat on the table covered in hand-drawn arrows and circles, the kind of markings that meant everything to the men who had stayed up all night tracing the same decline, and almost nothing to anyone else. The conversation turned, as conversations do, when the outcome is predetermined toward finding a way to say yes. Toward the careful reframing of the data, toward the managers who looked at the same charts and saw not a cliff, but a slope, not a certainty, but a maybe. Not a warning, but a risk that could be managed, accepted, filed away under the category of things that probably would not happen, because they had not happened before on all those other coldish days when the shuttle had flown and the O-rings had held more or less. Held well enough, with only a little erosion, a little blow, by nothing catastrophic, nothing that couldn't be explained away by the clever language of acceptable risk. And the engineers, outnumbered and exhausted and facing the full weight of an institution that had launched men into space and brought them home again, did what institutions often force their dissenters to do. They were overruled quietly, professionally, without anyone raising their voice or slamming a fist. Just a slow bureaucratic drift from no to maybe to yes, until Bob Lund, the vice president of engineering, the man who had stood with Boisjoli only minutes earlier, put down his pen and changed his mind. And the whole room seemed to exhale a collective breath that tasted, I imagine, not of relief, but of resignation. The launch approval was signed. If you could have seen that moment through the kind of lens that slows time to a crawl, you would have watched the pen move across the paper with a deliberation that seemed almost ceremonial. The ink flowed out in a thin, dark line that spelled a decision which could not be taken back, a decision that would follow the shuttle all the way to the pad and up into that cold blue sky the next morning. The sound it made was just the soft scratch of metal on paper, so small and ordinary that it would have been lost in the hum of the fluorescent lights and the shuffle of chairs, except that everyone in the room knew on some level what that sound meant, what it was going to mean, what it was already meaning as the ink dried and the paper was filed and the cold outside continued to fall degree by degree into a region where no one had ever asked an O-ring to keep its promise. And then it was done. The night outside was still deep, still frozen, and the stars over Cape Canaveral had shifted just little in the darkness so slowly that no one would have noticed if they had looked up. The engineers gathered their papers and switched off their screens, and the heaters on the pad kept humming their lullaby to a giant that was already committed to the sky. Nature had spoken in the language of ice and rigid rubber, and the humans with their schedules and their hopes had answered in the language of necessity. But all of that, the arguments, the signatures, the weary voices, would soon fade into the past, buried under the slow turning of the earth, while the cold simply remained unargued, with patient as the stars. The morning of January 28th, 1986, arrived with a sky so perfectly impossibly blue that it almost didn't seem real, like a painted backdrop someone had hung behind the launch pad while the world was still asleep. You could stand out there on the causeway, the cold air nipping at your cheeks, and look up into that endless dome of color and see absolutely nothing, not a wisp of cloud, not a smear of haze, just pure deep azure stretching from horizon to horizon. The kind of sky that makes you forget just for a moment how cold it actually is. Because it was cold. The temperature had dropped well below freezing overnight, and even now, with the sun beginning to climb above the Atlantic, the air still carried that sharp crystalline bite that only comes on winter mornings in Florida, the kind of cold that surprises tourists who packed for beaches and palm trees. Steam rose from the shuttle's external tank, where supercold propellants met the morning air, white plumes of vapor drifting lazily upward like the breath of some enormous, sleeping creature, carrying with them a faint, almost metallic tang, a whisper of something chemical and clean that mixed with the salt breeze coming off the marshes. The frost on the launch pad structures glittered in the early light, thousands of tiny ice crystals catching the sun and throwing it back in a million directions at once, a silent, shimmering field of cold diamonds. And Challenger herself, she stood there on pad 39B, majestic and utterly still, a tower of white and black and orange that seemed to belong more to some future century than to this quiet winter morning. The orbiter perched on the side of that massive rust-colored external tank like a delicate bird clinging to a giant sequoia, and the two solid rocket boosters flanking it rose straight and tall, their white casings gleaming in the sunlight, the whole assembly holding itself against gravity with a kind of patient certainty. If you had been there, and many were lining the beaches and the causeways wrapped in coats and clutching cups of coffee that steamed in the cold air, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the salt and the faint propellant tang, you would have felt something strange in that moment, a kind of suspended breath, a collective holding pattern shared by everyone who looked up at that machine and understood what it was about to attempt. You know how there are moments that feel like they're already memories, even while they're still happening. This was one of those, a moment where the present and the future seemed to overlap for just a heartbeat, and everything that was about to unfold was already somehow gathering itself in the cold morning light. The countdown continued its steady mechanical progression. A voice over speakers that had become so familiar to the people who worked there that it almost faded into the background of consciousness numbers, falling one after another like drops of water from a leaky faucet, each one a little closer to the moment when everything would change. A rhythm so steady, so unhurried, that you could almost forget it was counting toward anything at all. Families of the crew watched from a VIP area, their faces bright with pride, and something else, too. Something you might call a quiet, private anxiety held close under winter coats and hopeful smiles, a small, tender tension that never quite reached their eyes. Children held signs they had made with crayon and construction paper, the bright colors standing out against the gray of the viewing stands. Teachers who had followed Christa McAuliffe's journey felt their hearts beating a little faster as the final minutes ticked away, not with fear exactly, but with that particular kind of vicarious excitement that comes from watching someone do something you've always dreamed of doing yourself. And then the countdown reached its end. The main engines ignited first. You could see the bright, almost colorless flame, hear the crackling roar that built from a rumble into something that shook the ground even miles away, a sound so deep and so powerful that you felt it in your chest, that vibration traveling through the earth like a low, continuous earthquake that made the water in the marshes ripple in concentric circles. A spreading ring of perfect tiny waves, each one catching the sunlight for an instant before vanishing. For a few seconds, the shuttle held itself steady on the pad, the engines building to full thrust while the computers ran their final checks, and the vibration traveled outward and upward, pressing against the cold air like a giant hand. Then the solid rocket boosters lit. What happened next was overwhelming. Not just the sound which became something beyond noise, a physical presence that pressed against you from all sides and seemed to fill the entire universe, but the sight of it, the sheer impossible spectacle of 2 million pounds of metal and fuel and human hope lifting away from the ground and climbing into that perfect blue sky with a kind of unhurried majesty. The exhaust plume billowed out behind it in a churning column of white and gray, lit from within by the fierce orange brilliance of the boosters, and the shuttle rose on a pillar of fire that connected it to the earth like an umbilical cord of light, a bridge of incandescence stretching from the launch pad up into the heavens. The crowd cheered. They always cheered, but this time there was something extra in it, something about the cold and the delay, and the teacher who was going to space, and the sound of thousands of voices rose up to meet the roar of the engines as Challenger arced gracefully toward the heavens, a white arrow climbing higher and higher. You would have had to look very carefully in those first few seconds after liftoff to see what the high-speed cameras saw. And even then, you probably wouldn't have registered it as anything important. Just a small puff of black smoke, so small, so brief, that it could have been a trick of the light or some minor harmless venting from the booster joint. The kind of thing that happens in these immensely complex machines and is quickly forgotten. But the cameras running at hundreds of frames per second preserved that moment in excruciating detail, a thin, dark brushstroke against the overwhelming brightness of the exhaust plume appearing from the lower segment of the right solid rocket booster at the exact point where the segments joined together, a place where two precisely machined surfaces were supposed to seal perfectly, but in the cold that had seeped into the metal overnight had left the smallest of gaps. The O-ring had failed. It had failed in the cold, just as the engineers had feared it might fail so quickly and so quietly that no one watching from the ground had the slightest idea that anything was wrong. The tiny dark bloom appearing and then being swept away by the supersonic flow of the exhaust, gone so quickly that if you blinked, you would have missed it entirely. That puff of black smoke, I want to stay with it for a moment because it seems important to really see it, to understand how small things can sometimes carry the weight of entire futures. It lasted for maybe a second and a half, no more, a tiny dark bloom that emerged from the joint and then vanished against that vast column of fire and steam, against the brilliant blue canvas of the sky. It was almost nothing, a period at the end of a sentence that no one was reading yet. The cameras captured it, though, those unblinking mechanical eyes that recorded everything without judgment, without understanding, without the ability to look away. And maybe that's what gets me. You know, the thought that this one small dark plume lasting barely more than a heartbeat, was the only visible sign that something fundamental had gone wrong at the very beginning of the flight. Everything else looked perfect. The shuttle continued to rise, to accelerate, to trace that elegant curved path towards space that had become so familiar from dozens of launches before. The telemetry streaming back to mission control showed nothing unusual, or at least nothing that triggered any of the automated warnings, and the engineers watching their screens saw the numbers they expected to see, and the families on the VIP balcony continued to cheer and embrace each other, and the children held their signs higher, and the teachers in classrooms across America watching on televisions, wheeled in for the occasion, felt their hearts swell with a kind of vicarious pride that comes from watching someone do something extraordinary. And inside Challenger, the 7 crew members were experiencing the ride of their lives. The vibration during first stage was intense. Everyone knew that a shaking and rumbling that rattled your bones and made the instrument panels blur in front of your eyes, but it was normal. Everything was normal. The shuttle passed through Max Q, the point of maximum aerodynamic pressure, where the forces on the vehicle reached their peak, and the computers throttled the engines back to ease the strain on the structure. A smooth, automatic adjustment, completely routine. Then a voice from the ground. Mission Control making the call that had been made on every shuttle flight. A voice as calm and professional as any other Challenger. Go at throttle up. And Commander Dick Scobie, a man who had flown before, whose voice held no hint of alarm, only professionalism, only the calm, matter-of-fact tone of a pilot who had been here before and knew exactly what to expect, who had served in Vietnam and flown test aircraft and earned his place in that cockpit through years of dedication and skill, replied with the last words he ever spoke, spoken with the same steady, unhurried cadence he might have used to order a cup of coffee. Roger, go at throttle up. Let me stretch that moment out for you, because in remembering, in truly honoring what happened and what was lost, we can allow those syllables to hang in the air a little longer than they actually did. Roger, that one word, the standard acknowledgement that pilots have used since the earliest days of radio communication, a word so automatic that it comes without thinking. A verbal nod between professionals who trust each other completely. A small, compressed signal of understanding across the void. The engines answered the command, spooling back up to full power, pushing the shuttle faster and higher. Go at throttle up. Confirming the instruction, repeating it back as required by procedure, nothing more and nothing less. And in that small exchange of routine words, everything that needed to be said was already said. No fear. No premonition. Just a pilot and his crew doing their jobs on a cold morning that had turned into an impossibly beautiful day. You might wonder sometimes what it would feel like to speak words that will be remembered forever without knowing their weight. What it would feel like for those syllables to leave your lips and travel out into the sky, caught by radio waves and preserved in recordings that will be listened to again and again by people who were not yet born when you spoke them. I imagine, and of course I can only imagine, that there would be no special quality to it at all. No sense of significance settling on your shoulders like a mantle. Just another transmission, just another moment in a flight that until very recently had followed every expectation to the letter. From the ground, Challenger was now a brilliant white star climbing toward the zenith, its contrail painting a long, feathery arc across the morning sky. A stroke of pure white against that intense blue, so high and so fast that it seemed to be scribing its own path into the fabric of the atmosphere. The solid rocket boosters burned steadily, their exhaust forming that familiar column of white smoke that stretched all the way back to the launch pad, and the shuttle itself was difficult to see with the naked eye, just a tiny bright point at the very tip of that column, moving faster than anything on Earth had a right to move. The crowd had stopped cheering by now, not out of any premonition or concern, but simply because the launch had passed into its next phase, the part where you just watched in quiet awe as the vehicle shrank smaller and smaller against the immensity of the sky. A collective silence, a shared intake of breath, 1,000 faces tilted upward toward the same moving point of light. You could feel the sun warming your face now, the cold morning air finally beginning to relent, and if you closed your eyes for just a moment, you could almost convince yourself that it was going to be a beautiful day in every sense of the word. The kind of day where later you'd remember the chill but not really believe it, because the sunlight felt so gentle and so full of promise. The sound of the engines had faded to a distant rumble more felt, then heard a continuous low vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, so deep that it resonated in your bones without ever quite registering as a distinct noise. The marsh grasses rustled in a light breeze, carrying with them that clean green scent of winter vegetation, and the water in the lagoon caught the sunlight and threw it back in shimmering, dancing patterns that moved with the wind, 1,000 tiny mirrors rippling endlessly. Everything was calm. Everything was, as far as anyone knew, exactly as it should be. And far above, traveling faster than the speed of sound, Commander Scobie's voice had already become part of history. Those 4 simple words, "Roger, go it, throttle up," hanging in the ionosphere like a small flame that would never quite go out, a tiny point of light in the vast darkness that is always waiting just beyond the blue edge of the sky. A signal that had left the atmosphere and continued outward, carrying with it the calm, professional cadence of a man doing what he was meant to do. The shuttle continued its climb, and the 7 souls aboard continued their journey, carried forward by that overwhelming power, and by something else too, something that had brought them all to this moment, a willingness to leave the safe ground behind and reach for something beyond it. That willingness doesn't end, I think, even when the vehicle itself does. It just transforms. It becomes something quieter, something that settles into the memory of those who witnessed it and those who learned of it later. a small, steady glow that isn't diminished by distance or time. You can still stand on that causeway today on a cold January morning when the sky is impossibly blue. And if you look up at the place where Challenger's contrail once traced its path across the heavens, you might feel something of what those people felt in the seconds before they understood what they were seeing. That pure, uncomplicated wonder, that sense of watching something magnificent unfold exactly as it was meant to. The air still smells of salt and marsh grass and just a hint of frost, and the water still shimmers in the same timeless way, and somewhere in the vast blue above you, the echo of those 73 seconds still lingers, a perfect moment suspended in the amber of a winter morning, when the shuttle rose and the crowd cheered, and a man's voice, calm and sure, spoke words that would never quite stop traveling toward the stars. The morning sky that January morning was so perfectly, impossibly blue. I always come back to that color when I think about it now. A shade so deep and clear that it seemed to hold the whole winter inside a single breath. And for 73 seconds, the bright white column of smoke traced a flawless arc across that blue, climbing with such steady purpose that it became the only thing the eye could follow. Then, almost before anyone understood what was happening, the shape of the light seemed to shift. It was very slight. You know that first change, a tiny wobble in the plume like a reflection on water that someone has barely touched with a fingertip. The kind of thing you might not even notice unless you were looking right at it, which of course everyone was. But still, the mind needed a moment to catch up. And then the sky bloomed. Far above the Mars coast, traveling at nearly twice the speed of sound, a thin jet of burning gas had already begun its work. It cut through the metal of the booster strut. A heat so intense it could slice through steel like a scalpel through silk. But no one on the ground could see that, of course. No one could sense the slow, deliberate unzippering of the vessel. The shuttle was not a bomb. It didn't detonate in the way we might picture from war films or fireworks. What happened next was not a single shattering roar. It was something quieter, I think, something almost gentle in its violence. A structural tearing that came from aerodynamic forces pressing in at Mach 1.9, pulling the very form of the vehicle apart. It simply let go of its own shape. I've always hesitated to use the word explosion for that moment. What really occurred was a great and gradual coming apart, as if the hydrogen and oxygen met the open air in a sudden, hungry embrace. And that embrace painted itself across the sky in a fireball so vast and so silent that for a long, stretched-out moment, no one understood what they were looking at. The fireball unfolded like a terrible flower. a bloom of white and gold and orange and a strange poisonous shade of crimson. It pulsed outward in what felt like slow motion. You could see it from the grandstand, from the press site, from the rooftops of nearby towns, a sphere of light blossoming where the shuttle had been just a heartbeat before. It expanded and expanded until it filled a portion of the sky that your arms, if you stretched them wide, could not contain. Then, as the petals of fire curled outward and began to fade, something else emerged from the heart of the light, two trails of smoke. They twisted away from each other in a perfect, impossible symmetry. One arced upward and to the left, the other curved down and to the right. Each trail braided itself into the thin blue air like ink poured into water, branching and branching again. The whole spectacle resolved into a shape so peculiar, so unmistakably intentional looking, that it seemed the sky itself was trying to speak. The Y-shaped smoke trails looked like a question mark written in the sky, an answer we were too horrified to read. I still believe all these years later that if you had been standing there on that causeway, with the cold marsh wind just stirring against your cheek, you would have stared at that shape and felt in some deep and wordless part of yourself that the question was being asked directly. And no answer would ever come. On the ground, the silence arrived like a wave. You must understand that for 73 seconds the air had been filled with continuous rolling thunder, the sound of those massive solid rocket boosters pushing the shuttle upward. A noise so deep and so pervasive that it vibrated in the chest, a sound that felt like the heartbeat of the planet itself. Then within a single second, that sound was gone. The absence was so complete, so sudden, that it became a presence of its own. A thick, almost physical blanket settled over the crowd and pressed against the eardrums, making the whole world feel muffled and far away. People in the grandstand froze. Their hands were still half lifted in mid-wave, their mouths still open from the last cheer. The smiles that had been fixed on their faces curdled very slowly into something else. Not yet grief, not yet horror, just a deep, dawning confusion that pulled at the corners of the eyes. I remember hearing about a little girl in a red coat. Near the front of the viewing area, she was clutching a small American flag on a wooden stick. And she kept waving it maybe for 3 or 4 more seconds after everyone else had stopped. Her small arm moving back and forth while her face tilted upward, searching for the shuttle that was no longer a single bright star climbing toward space, but a scattering of smaller lights spreading across the heavens. Her mother's hand moved to her shoulder gently, and the flag stopped waving. The two of them stood there frozen in the sudden quiet. All around them, the air was filling with the soft sounds of people just beginning to breathe again, shaky, uncertain breaths that caught in the throat and came out as half-whispered words. Fragments of prayers and questions that no one could answer. The commentator's voice, when it came through the public address system, seemed to belong to another world entirely. His name was Steve, I think one of those steady, practiced voices from Mission Control. A man whose job was to narrate the poetry of a launch with calm precision. He had been doing exactly that for the whole ascent, his words flowing in that familiar measured cadence. But now his voice cracked. Just slightly. A tiny fissure that split the air and let something raw spill through. Into that fissure fell the weight of everything that was happening. He paused, and that pause stretched and stretched until it became a silence of its own. A gap in the official record where comprehension should have been. Then he said those words that would never be forgotten. Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously, a major malfunction. The vehicle has exploded. The words hung there, suspended in the cold January air. The way he said obviously made it sound like an apology. Like a man who had spent his whole career describing triumphs and was now being asked to shape a catastrophe into language that could be broadcast to a world still expecting to celebrate. The debris began to fall then. This is the part that I always find myself coming back to when I think about that morning, the long, slow descent of the pieces. Each one dropped in an arc that seemed to defy the usual rules of gravity, taking an impossibly long time to obey the pull of the earth. There were dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Each a tiny point of light, tracing a graceful parabola against the blue. Like a handful of stars that had decided quietly and without any fuss to return to the ground from which they had come. Some of them trailed thin ribbons of smoke. Some glinted in the sun like shards of a broken mirror. All of them moved with a kind of terrible elegance, a slow-motion dance that held the eye and refused to let it look away. You could track a single piece, a small bright fragment, perhaps a torn section of the wing or part of the fuselage, and watch it arc upward for just a moment longer than you expected. Then it would begin to curve downward, picking up speed only very gradually, the way a feather might fall if the air were thick as honey. The whole sky seemed to be raining in reverse. Or maybe the world had simply forgotten how to hurry. In that strange, elongated time, every second felt like a minute, and every minute felt like an hour stretched thin. The smoke. There was so much smoke, and it smelled of things that had no right to be drifting over a marshy coastline on a winter morning. A sharp, acrid tang that burned the back of the throat just a little. It carried with it the ghost of burned fuel and something metallic, the taste of the inside of a machine, the very heart of a great engine that had opened itself to the air. The wind carried it slowly, gently across the lagoon. As it moved over the water, it left a faint, oily sheen on the surface, a shimmer of rainbow colors that danced for a while and then dissolved into the ripples. The smell lingered long after the smoke itself had thinned, a scent that would never quite leave the memory of anyone who breathed it in that day. And the temperature played its part in the strangeness of the moment. Because the fireball had been so bright, so impossibly hot, you would have expected to feel its warmth pressing against your face, even from miles away. But what came instead was the raw, cold essence of a January sky. The chill you always feel near the coast in winter when the sun is still low. The people standing on the causeway pulled their coats tighter, hands slipping deeper into pockets, and I think maybe that was just the wind picking up. Or maybe it was something else that none of them could name. There is something about the way a crowd moves when it is struck by a shared, unspoken grief. A thing you might see only once in a lifetime. And when you do it, rewrite something inside you. The grandstand didn't erupt into panic. There was no screaming, no stampede, none of the chaos that fiction would later imagine for that moment. Instead, the people simply grew still. Then very slowly, they began to move toward one another. Hands reached out to grasp the shoulders of strangers. Faces turned left and right to meet the eyes of anyone who might share the weight. A man in a dark blue windbreaker pressed his palm against his mouth as if trying to hold something in. An older woman in a gray coat reached down and took the hand of the little girl with the flag. The two of them stood there in a small island of quiet, watching the smoke trails continue their slow, indifferent fading against the relentless blue above. The world was still turning. The sun climbing toward its noonday height, the marsh grasses swaying in the breeze that smelled of salt and cold earth. All of it seemed impossibly detached, impossibly unconcerned with the grief that was settling like a fine dust over everything human on that narrow strip of coastline. Perhaps this is the reason why when I think back to that morning, what comes to me isn't the sound of the radio or the voice of the commentator or even the image of the fireball itself. It's the quiet that followed. The long, hollow silence that seemed to stretch all the way to the edge of the atmosphere and beyond. A silence that felt like the whole world holding its breath, waiting for something that would never arrive. The pieces of the shuttle continued to fall, and the smoke trails continued to twist and spread. The 7 small points of light that had once been moving together toward the stars had become something else entirely. Something that no words in any language could quite capture. They had gone beyond language now, beyond the reach of anything except memory. And the strange, aching beauty of a winter sky that held them in its palm and would never let them go. And somewhere in that silence, if you listened very closely, you might have heard the faintest echo of a voice. Steady, calm, impossibly far away. Still traveling outward toward the darkness between the stars. Speaking its last words over and over into the infinite. Carrying with it nothing but a simple human courage that had lifted 7 ordinary people into the sky on a morning much like any other. The cabin itself did not explode. This is a truth that NASA held close for a long time. A quiet truth wrapped in technical reports and the stunned silence that followed that morning. You see, the crew compartment was built of something exceptionally strong, reinforced aluminum and materials designed to hold against the violent forces of launch and the emptiness of space. It was torn free from the fireball intact, a small white capsule ripped from the heart of the spreading cloud, and for a moment it simply continued. It rose higher on sheer momentum, a tiny sealed room climbing against the endless blue, carrying 7 people into a silence that must have felt like the edge of everything. I want you to imagine that ascent now, not as a tragedy in motion, but as a strange, suspended moment outside of ordinary time. The cabin tumbling slowly against the vast canvas of the sky, the sunlight catching its white surface as it turned, and inside. Inside, there was no chaos, no screaming wind, no tearing metal. The cockpit voice recorder would later reveal only the steady, professional hum of the crew communicating calmly, the gentle hiss of emergency oxygen systems activating the muffled whisper of air against the exterior as the cabin began its long fall toward the Atlantic far below. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. This is the number that the recovery teams would eventually piece together, but numbers can never hold what those seconds contained. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The cabin reached the peak of its trajectory, and then it began to fall. Not a violent plummet, not at first, but a gradual surrender to gravity, a slow acceleration through air that grew denser with every passing moment. The ocean was still impossibly far below, a sheet of deep blue-gray stretching toward horizons that curved with the shape of the earth, while above, the sky was thinning into the blackness of space. Between these two infinities, the small white cabin descended in a silence broken only by the soft sound of breathing, the rustle of fabric, the faint mechanical whisper of systems that had been designed for a very different journey. You might wonder what it felt like inside that cabin during those minutes, and I will tell you what the evidence suggests, though the answer is a gentle one. Perhaps the gentlest part of this whole story. The investigators who later examined the recovered compartment found something that speaks to a profound and quiet courage. The emergency oxygen masks, the ones stored above the seats, had been deployed. And three of them, three distinct personal emergency air packs, had been manually activated, a detail that I always thought changes everything. This means that someone, or perhaps more than one someone, in the darkness and the cold and the tumbling of the cabin, had reached up with steady hands and deliberately pulled the activation pins. An act that required presence of mind, a clear awareness of the situation, a choice made in the face of, well, in the face of what must have been known. The cabin temperature was dropping now, the frigid altitude seeping through the walls in a way that no amount of insulation could prevent. The air inside grew cold, the kind of cold that settles into bones, and the emergency oxygen carried a sterile taste, clean and faintly metallic. As the masks pressed against faces in the dim cabin interior, I always thought about those hands reaching up in the dark and what that gesture meant. It was not desperation. It was procedure, perhaps, but more than that, it was an affirmation. A refusal to yield to the silence without first doing what could be done. 3 masks. 3 hands that reached out in the dark, an act of stubborn hope. The others may have been unconscious or simply still, but those 3 hands moved with purpose, and that purpose speaks across the decades. The fall continued through air that grew thicker and more resistant, and now the exterior of the cabin began to register the pressure of the descent, the wind outside rising from a whisper to a low, steady hum that vibrated through the walls. Inside, the 7 people who had left the earth that morning to touch the stars were suspended in a strange and terrible grace, weightless still, or nearly so. The cabins tumbled slow enough that the forces of deceleration had not yet pressed them into their seats. Objects floated in the dimness, a checklist, a pen, a small personal item that someone had brought aboard as a memento. The sun through the small windows cast shifting patterns of light and shadow as the cabin rotated, a slow kaleidoscope of brightness and dark, and the ocean below grew closer, more distinct, its surface resolving into the patterns of waves that, from this height, still looked gentle, almost motionless. Perhaps this is the moment to speak of what the sea looked like from above during those final minutes. The Atlantic stretched out in all directions, a deep and patient blue, touched here and there by the white specks of breaking waves. The afternoon sun laying a path of silver across its surface. The coast of Florida was visible as a thin green line to the west, and the sky above it was filled with the soft white cumulus clouds that gather over warm water, innocent and indifferent to the small object falling from the edge of space. The temperature outside the cabin was still far below freezing, but the friction of the descent was beginning to warm the exterior surface. And somewhere in the structure, the metal began to expand and contract with tiny pinging sounds that no one inside would have heard over the growing rush of air. I want to pause here for a moment and let the image settle the cabin suspended against the sky, the endless sea spreading out below. And inside, 7 human beings who had trained for years to face the dangers of space, who had accepted the risks as the price of reaching for something beyond the ordinary. They knew, in that silent fall, they faced the void with nothing but courage and a few breaths of emergency oxygen. There was no panic in the evidence, no indication of terror. The cockpit voice recorder captured only professional communication, the calm exchange of information, the quiet assertions of a crew doing their duty, even as the world outside had become something unrecognizable. I find something almost unbearably moving in that calmness, in the choice to continue the routines of their training when those routines could no longer change the outcome. The cabin continued to fall, and now the speed was building the exterior wind rising to a roar that the insulated walls could not entirely mask. 2 minutes had passed, perhaps a little more, and the ocean was no longer an abstraction, but a physical surface rushing upward with terrible speed. The crew would have felt the first hints of deceleration, now a gentle pressure beginning to push them back into their seats, a return of weight after the long minutes of free fall. The cabin walls grew colder still, the metal sweating with condensation, and the emergency oxygen continued to flow with its steady hiss. A sound that must have become a kind of companion, a rhythm to focus on as the world outside grew larger and more immediate. The blue of the sky was shifting now, the deep indigo of the upper atmosphere giving way to the brighter cerulean of the lower altitudes, and the clouds that had seemed so distant were now rushing past the windows in white, formless streaks. There is something strange that happens when I try to imagine those final seconds. The mind wants to impose a drama, a cinematic climax with music and desperate words, but the evidence points to something far quieter, something almost beyond words. The cabin, still intact, still sealed, fell through the last layers of atmosphere at a speed that the recovery teams would later calculate at more than 330 kilometers per hour, a velocity that makes the interval between awareness and oblivion almost non-existent. The impact with the sea was the end, instantaneous and complete, a force that erased all questions, all fears, all memories in a single unified moment that needed no narration. The cabin struck the surface of the Atlantic, and the water at that speed offered no more give than concrete. You know, it's hard to say that gently, but it's part of the truth. The structure that had protected 7 people through the violence of launch and the cold of space crumpled instantly, and the ocean swallowed everything in a surge of spray and foam that rose into the air and then fell back, leaving only spreading ripples and the distant sound of waves. I want to sit with that silence for a moment, if you will let me. The debris field that would later be mapped by recovery vessels stretched across miles of ocean floor, small pieces of the shuttle scattered like seeds, but the crew cabin itself settled deep in the darkness far below the reach of sunlight, carrying with it the remains of 7 ordinary people who had done something extraordinary. The universe, as you know, has no room for the movie miracles we sometimes imagine. There was no last-second rescue, no improbable survival. There was only the sea, the silence, and the long, slow work of recovery that would take months to complete. And yet, the masks, the activated masks, those hands that moved in the dark. I think about those hands more than I think about the impact, more than I think about the debris field. Because those hands tell the truest story of what it means to be human, to face the infinite with nothing but procedure and stubborn hope, to refuse the darkness, even when the darkness has already arrived. The recovery teams who later examined the cabin found other small things. Personal items. Patches from the mission. A helmet with its visor still intact. These objects now reside in climate-controlled storage, preserved as reminders of something that is difficult to articulate. Something about the fragility of our bodies and the resilience of our intentions. The families received what could be returned, and the rest was committed to the silence of archives and the slow, patient work of memory that transforms grief into something bearable. Something almost gentle with the passage of years. I do not want to leave you with the image of the impact, because that is not where the story truly ends. The story ends, if it ends at all, with the quiet realization that those 2 minutes and 45 seconds contained something that no accident investigation report could ever capture. They contained consciousness, awareness, the presence of mind to reach for oxygen, to check instruments, to continue the routines of a mission that had already transcended the ordinary boundaries of life and death. The crew of Challenger did not die in an explosion. They died in a fall, yes, but more than that. They lived through a fall, lived with full knowledge and what must have been a profound and terrible clarity. And in that living, they demonstrated something that belongs not to tragedy, but to the deepest reservoirs of human dignity. I think what I am trying to say is that the silence inside that falling cabin was not empty. It was filled with the steady professional voices of people who had chosen to venture beyond the protective shell of the atmosphere, who had accepted the risks as the necessary companion to discovery, and who, in the last minutes of their lives, continued to act as the highly trained astronauts they were. The masks were activated. The procedures were followed. The calm remained. And somewhere in that calm, there is a kind of peace that even the cold Atlantic cannot erase. A peace that passes understanding and settles finally into the simple, enduring fact of their courage. The sun continued its slow arc across the sky that day, and the waves of the Atlantic rose and fell with the same rhythm they had followed for billions of years. The world turned, and the news spread, and the grief came in waves that broke over the families, the nation, the watching world. But deep beneath the surface, in the quiet of the ocean floor, the last physical traces of the journey came to rest. And the silence that had accompanied the fall gave way to an even deeper silence, a silence that remains undisturbed to this day. The crew had traveled as far as any human beings had ever traveled, not in distance, but in the quality of their final moments, the terrifying and sacred privilege of facing the void with eyes open, masks, activated, procedures followed. The steady rhythm of breath continuing until there was no more breath to draw. I will sit here a little longer before I continue. If you are still listening, perhaps somewhere between sleep and waking, you might find yourself drifting on the same quiet rhythms, the same slow surge of waves, the same gentle dissolution of boundaries between self and sky and sea. The story is almost done now, but the silence remains. And I think that silence has more to tell you than any words ever could. The silence of that January morning had long since given way to something else, a silence of a different kind, one that settled over the entire nation like a heavy muffling blanket laid gently over a sleeping child. You know the kind of silence I mean, the one that comes after a shock so deep that words simply fail, that even the most eloquent voices can only stumble toward the edge of it without ever quite reaching the center. President Ronald Reagan stood before the cameras that evening, his voice carrying the weight of a nation's grief, and he reached for something that might give shape to a loss too vast for ordinary language. He quoted a poem, you see, one written by a young pilot named John Gillespie Magee, who had himself slipped away from the earth far too young, and the words he spoke seemed to hang in the air like a fading contrail against a darkening sky. They slipped the surly bonds of earth, to touch the face of God. The phrase echoed through living rooms and kitchens, through bars and churches, and quiet bedrooms where people sat alone staring at television screens. And for a moment, just a moment, the horror of what had happened was wrapped in something that felt almost like poetry, almost like prayer. But poetry and prayer, as comforting as they are, they cannot answer the question that burns in the human heart after a disaster. The question that wakes you in the small hours of the night, that whispers beneath the surface of every memorial service and every flickering candle. Why? Why did this happen to these 7 people, these teachers and pilots and dreamers who had climbed into a machine built by the finest minds of their generation? The Rogers Commission was formed to find that answer, a gathering of experts and investigators who would spend months sifting through the wreckage of metal and memory, searching for the single point of failure that had transformed a morning of wonder into a morning of ash. But from the very first days of the investigation, there was a tension in the air, a sense that some truths were being held at arm's length, wrapped in layers of bureaucratic language that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate. NASA, the agency that had put men on the moon, the agency that had taught the world to dream of stars, NASA was holding something back. And into this quiet struggle for truth walked a man whose name you might already know, Richard Feynman. He was a Nobel laureate in physics, a man who had spent his life chasing the strange and beautiful rules that govern the universe, and he was also, well, he was not the kind of person who could easily tolerate obscurity or evasion. Feynman was the one who would later write in words that still echo through engineering classrooms and boardrooms alike. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. He arrived at the hearings with a mind that refused to accept comforting fictions, and he began to ask the questions that others seemed reluctant to voice. What about the O-rings? Those simple rubber seals that circle the joints of the solid rocket boosters, the ones designed to keep the searing gases contained within their proper channels. What about the cold that morning? The unprecedented cold that had left ice clinging to the launch tower like a second skin of crystalline warning. The official briefings had mentioned the O-rings, of course, had discussed them in the careful, measured language of institutional caution. But Feynman was not a man of careful, measured language. He was a man of experiment, of direct observation, of the kind of simple, devastating clarity that cuts through fog like a lighthouse beam. The hearing room itself was a place of muted colors and stale air, the kind of government chamber where countless hours of testimony had been delivered beneath fluorescent lights that hummed their own quiet, indifferent song. You can picture it now as you lie there in the darkness, the long tables arranged in a curve, the microphones waiting to catch every syllable. The faces of commissioners and witnesses and journalists all turned toward the center of the room where the day's proceedings would unfold. There was a faint smell of chalk dust. You know, the kind that lingers in old institutional buildings. And the air felt still and slightly warm, the way air does when too many bodies have been sitting too long in a space designed for official gravity rather than human comfort. Someone had brought a glass of ice water to the table, a simple thing, the kind of thing you might set on your nightstand and forget about until the ice has melted and the glass is beaded with condensation. But this glass, this ordinary drinking glass filled with ordinary water and ordinary ice cubes, it was about to become the instrument of a revelation. Before the demonstration, there was a small pause, as if Feynman was giving the universe a chance to prove him wrong. His hand reached for the glass, and the room seemed to hold its breath, though no one yet understood what was about to happen. He was holding something else too, a small piece of O-ring rubber, the same material that had been used in the seals of the solid rocket boosters, the same black synthetic compound that was supposed to remain flexible and resilient across a range of temperatures, the same material that had been subjected to the freezing cold of that January launch morning. Feynman's fingers closed around the rubber, and you might have noticed, if you were sitting close enough, how unremarkable it looked. Just a strip of dark material, pliable in his warm hand, the kind of thing that seems almost too simple to be the key to understanding a catastrophe. The glass was right there in front of him, the ice cubes floating in the water with that particular clarity that ice has when it's very cold, the glass itself beginning to sweat a little as the room's warmth met its chill surface. Feynman's hand moved with the deliberate, unhurried precision of a man who has spent decades handling the delicate apparatus of physics experiments. He took the O-ring sample and he pressed it down into the ice water, submerging it in that sudden, shocking cold. The sound was nothing dramatic, just the soft clink of rubber against glass, the tiny splash of water being displaced, the faint crystalline tinkle of ice cubes shifting against each other in the liquid. But the silence that followed, the silence was the kind of silence that fills a room when every person present suddenly understands that they are witnessing something irreversible, something that cannot be taken back or explained away. A few seconds passed. Time seemed to stretch itself thin across that hearing room, each moment expanding to fill far more than its usual share of the clock's steady rhythm, the way time does when you are watching something that matters, when your attention is so completely focused that ordinary duration simply ceases to apply. Feynman lifted the rubber from the water and he held it up for the cameras to see. And the thing that everyone understood in that moment was this: the rubber had changed. When it was warm in his hand, it had been soft and flexible and forgiving. But now, after just a short time in the ice water, it had become rigid and brittle, a material that had lost its essential nature, that could no longer do the job it was designed to do. He bent it, and instead of springing back, instead of resuming its original shape, the way rubber should, it stayed bent. The elasticity was gone. The resilience was gone. The seal that was supposed to hold back fire and death, it had failed before the first flame ever touched it. Feynman's voice when he spoke was calm, the calm of a man who is not delivering an accusation, but simply stating a fact, the kind of fact that exists independently of human wishes or institutional loyalties. He explained what everyone in the room could already see with their own eyes, and his words were simple enough that any child could understand them, technical enough that no engineer could refute them. The O-rings had lost their elasticity in the cold. The cold of that January morning, the cold that had turned the launch pad into a landscape of ice and frozen warning. That cold had transformed the seals from flexible safeguards into brittle barriers waiting to fail. And when the boosters ignited, when the immense pressures of combustion surged through the joints, the stiffened rubber could not expand to fill the gap, and the gap became a breach, and the breach became a plume of burning gas, and the plume became the beginning of the end. You might think listening to this story that the tragedy of Challenger was a failure of machines, but the truth that Feynman helped to reveal was something different, something more unsettling and more deeply human. It was a failure of management, a failure of the system that was supposed to ensure that reality would always take precedence over public relations. The engineers who had raised concerns about the O-rings in cold weather, they had been overruled, their warnings buried beneath layers of institutional optimism and schedule pressure, and the quiet, corrosive assumption that success was inevitable, because it had always been inevitable before. Feynman's ice water demonstration cut through all of that, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple, because it showed that the laws of physics do not negotiate, do not compromise, do not care about launch schedules or congressional funding or the reputation of an agency that had once reached the moon. The stunned faces in the hearing room caught the fluorescent light in expressions of dawning comprehension. Journalists scribbling notes with a new urgency, commissioners exchanging glances that seemed to acknowledge without words that the landscape of the investigation had shifted irreversibly. And somewhere beyond that room, beyond the cameras and the microphones and the official transcripts that would preserve this moment for history, somewhere in the wider world, the families of the 7 astronauts were watching, and the engineers who had tried to speak up were watching, and a nation that had been told comforting stories about poetry and the face of God was beginning to understand the colder, harder truth that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. The ice water in that glass had done more than demonstrate a material failure. It had exposed a failure of humility, a loss of the simple recognition that the universe does not grant exceptions, that the physical world operates according to rules that cannot be overruled by memos or meetings or the confident assurances of people who have forgotten how to listen. Feynman set the piece of rubber down on the table, and the hearing continued, and the investigation would eventually produce its final report, with its careful findings and its measured recommendations. But something had changed that day in that room with that glass of water. The truth had been unveiled, and once truth is unveiled, it cannot be covered again, no matter how many layers of language are draped across it. The afternoon light through the windows of the hearing room had shifted slightly by the time the session ended, the way afternoon light does, gradually withdrawing its warmth and leaving behind the cooler tones of approaching evening. The ice in the glass had mostly melted by then, the water, now room temperature, the dramatic cold of the demonstration having long since dissipated into the ambient air. But the cold that mattered, the cold of that January launch morning, that cold would remain in the memory of the investigation, a permanent reminder that the margin between success and catastrophe can be as thin as a rubber seal, as unforgiving as the temperature at which a material forgets how to flex. I want you to imagine for a moment that you are sitting in that hearing room, but from a great distance, as though watching through a window that softens every edge and mutes every sound. The voices are just a murmur. Now the faces just shapes in the gentle dimness, and the whole scene is receding slowly into the past where it belongs. Feynman's hand, the one that held the rubber, the one that reached into the ice water and pulled the truth up into the light. It rests now on the table, still and quiet, the demonstration complete. The glass of water sits there too, no longer a vessel of revelation, but just a glass of water again, its work done, its purpose fulfilled. And somewhere far away beyond the hearing room, beyond the investigation, beyond even the memory of the disaster itself, the 7 astronauts are still drifting, but in that strange, suspended way that memory creates, drifting and never quite arriving, held forever in the last chapter of a story that has almost reached its end. The truth, once known, becomes a kind of silence of its own, not the silence of concealment, but the silence that follows when a question has been answered so completely that nothing more needs to be said. Feynman understood this, I think, understood that the real work of investigation was not to assign blame, but to reveal what had always been true, what had been there from the beginning, waiting in the cold morning air for someone brave enough to look directly at it. And now, as the hearing room fades from view, and the voices grow softer and softer, that truth settles around you, like a blanket, not cold anymore, but simply true, simply complete. I'm sitting here now in the quiet of this room, watching the lamplight pool softly on the wall beside me. And I wonder if you can still feel the weight of that story settling into your bones, the way the cold morning air of January 1986 seemed to linger long after the smoke had cleared from the sky. It's strange, how a moment that lasted only seconds can stretch across decades, can reach into a quiet bedroom on an ordinary night and touch someone who wasn't even born. when it happened. But that's the nature of stories like this one. They don't really end when the investigation closes or when the memorials are built. They continue drifting slowly through time like the fragments of a dream you can't quite remember, but can't quite forget either. The aftermath of Challenger was a kind of silence that fell over the entire space program, a silence that felt heavier than any explosion could have been. NASA's age of innocence, as some called it, didn't just end. It dissolved the way morning frost dissolves from a window when the sun finally reaches it, leaving behind only the faintest trace of moisture, the memory of cold. The shuttle program halted for nearly 3 years. Every launch postponed, every schedule rewritten, every assumption about safety dismantled and examined under the harshest possible light. New laws were drafted in quiet committee rooms, their language dry and precise, but written with the invisible ink of 7 lives that had been given to illustrate the cost of oversight. The Rogers Commission report, thousands of pages thick, became a kind of scripture that engineers would study for generations. Not because it contained answers to every question, but because it taught them how to ask the right ones. I remember thinking, as I read through those old documents about the strange relationship humans have with the edge of things. The edge of the atmosphere, the edge of knowledge, the edge of what a rubber seal can withstand when the temperature drops just a few degrees too far. We build machines that can carry us into the void, and then we discover that the void has its own rules, its own quiet, unforgiving physics that doesn't care about our launch schedules or our press conferences or our dreams of conquering the stars. There is a line, perhaps, between the courage of exploration and the arrogance of believing we can predict everything. A line as thin as the O-ring that failed on that January morning, as invisible as the plume of smoke that signaled the beginning of the end. The astronauts knew about that line, I think. They lived with it every day of their training. Every moment they sat strapped into a vehicle that was essentially a controlled explosion aimed at the heavens. And yet they climbed in anyway, not because they were reckless, but because they understood something about the value of reaching beyond what seems safe, what seems reasonable, what seems possible. The sky tonight, the one outside your window, it holds no flames now, only the steady light of stars that watched the Challenger rise and fall so many years ago. Those same stars, unchanged by our small tragedies and triumphs, continue to burn in their distant, ancient silence, witnessing everything and remembering nothing. I find that thought oddly comforting, actually. The idea that the universe is vast enough to absorb our mistakes without judgment, vast enough to hold both our greatest achievements and our most devastating failures in the same patient star-filled darkness. The Challenger didn't reach those stars, not really, but something of the crew's intention, their willingness to try their quiet professionalism right up until the last recorded word on that cockpit voice recorder, Something of that drifted upward anyway, becoming part of the atmosphere, part of the memory of space itself. The lessons of Challenger haven't faded, you know. They float out there still like silent warnings suspended in the void, visible to anyone who takes the time to look up and remember. Every time humans reach toward the stars, every time a new rocket ignites on a launch pad, somewhere in the world, those lessons are present, not as fear, not as hesitation, but as a kind of quiet wisdom earned at the highest possible cost. Engineers double-check their calculations. Managers listen more carefully to concerns raised by their teams. The words, "It's probably fine," carry a weight they didn't carry before that January morning. And somewhere in the back of every astronaut's mind, I imagine there's an acknowledgement that the physics of space travel doesn't negotiate, doesn't compromise, doesn't make exceptions for bravery or good intentions. Perhaps the bravest thing we do is sleep under that same sky, trusting that tomorrow will accept our fragile hopes. I mean this quite sincerely. Every night, when we close our eyes and surrender to the darkness, we're making a kind of peace with uncertainty, a kind of truce with all the things we cannot control. The astronauts understood this better than most, I suspect. They trained for years to control what could be controlled, and then they had to find a way to release the rest, to trust the machines and the physics and the thousands of people who had contributed to their mission. And in the end, when the margins between success and catastrophe narrowed to a single cold morning, they were still trusting, still calm, still moving through their checklists with the quiet discipline of people who had made peace with the edge of things. Tonight, I want you to release something. I want you to let go of the pursuit of perfection that follows you into your sleep. The voice that whispers about everything you should have done differently today. Every deadline looming on tomorrow's horizon. The sky above your bed, the one you can't see but can feel through the roof and the ceiling, and the gentle darkness of this room. That sky is not asking anything of you right now. It's not measuring your achievements or cataloging your mistakes or keeping score in some cosmic ledger of worthiness. It's just there. A dome of peace, not a place to conquer. A blanket of stars that has witnessed every human triumph and every human failure, and still returns each night to offer its quiet, indifferent beauty to anyone willing to receive it. The Challenger crew in their final moments were not conquering anything. They were simply present, simply doing their work, simply existing in that strange space between Earth and the infinite. And now, all these years later, their memory has become something softer than tragedy. It's become a reminder that life is fragile and brief and impossibly precious, and that the measure of it isn't found in the things we achieve, but in the quiet courage with which we face the unknown. The 7 of them, they're not suffering anymore. They're not cold anymore. They're just part of the sky now, part of the story, part of the long, patient memory of a species that keeps reaching outward even when the reaching costs everything. You can feel it now, I think, the way the weight of this story is beginning to soften around its edges, the way the sharp lines of memory are blurring into something gentler, something more like forgiveness. The hearing room is far behind us now. The cold morning in Florida has given way to the ordinary warmth of this room, the ordinary softness of your pillow, the ordinary miracle of your breathing. And outside, beyond the window, the night continues its slow, ancient rotation, the stars tracing their familiar paths across the sky, indifferent to the small dramas of the creatures sleeping beneath them. The Challenger flag, the one with the 7 stars arranged in that particular pattern, I imagine it hanging somewhere quiet now in a museum or a memorial hall, its fabric slightly faded from years of patient display. The cross formation of those stars, the way they mirror the constellation that ancient sailors used to navigate uncharted waters, there's something beautiful about that, something that transcends the tragedy and becomes simply symbolic. A reminder that we navigate by the lights of those who came before us, that every journey into the unknown is guided by the memory of earlier journeys, some of which ended safely, and some of which did not. Your breathing is slower now, I notice, or I imagine I notice, from this distance, from this quiet place where the words are beginning to dissolve into something closer to music, something closer to the rhythm of waves on a distant shore. The bedside lamp beside you, the one with its soft golden glow, it's creating a small circle of warmth in the darkness, a tiny temporary universe where nothing is required of you except rest. The sheets smell faintly of lavender, or perhaps that's just the memory of lavender, the suggestion of something clean and calming that your mind has conjured to help you drift further from the shore of waking consciousness. I want to tell you one last thing before I go, something that has nothing to do with space shuttles or investigations or the physics of cold rubber. It has to do with the way you've been carrying something heavy, something you might not even have a name for. The pursuit of perfection, it's exhausting, isn't it? The constant effort to control outcomes, to anticipate every variable, to ensure that nothing goes wrong on your watch. But the lesson of Challenger, the one that settles deepest into the bones after all the technical analysis is done, that lesson is about the beauty of trying anyway, even when the margins are thin and the temperatures are low and the odds are uncertain. Not because success is guaranteed, but because the attempt itself has dignity. The attempt itself is worthy of honor. The crew of the Challenger didn't fail. They simply flew into a cold morning and became something larger than astronauts, larger than a mission, larger than a single moment in history. They became a reminder that courage doesn't guarantee safety, that preparation doesn't eliminate risk, that even the most carefully planned journey can end somewhere unexpected. And yet, the journey was worth making. The reaching was worth doing. The quiet professionalism, the calm voices on the cockpit recorder, all of it was worth something. All of it still means something floating out there in the silence between stars. Your blanket is warm now, isn't it? The weight of it across your shoulders, the way it holds you in place against the gentle pull of sleep. It's a small mercy, this warmth, this softness, this temporary shelter from everything that waits beyond the walls of this room. The inside temperature is exactly right. Not too hot and not too cold. A kind of Goldilocks zone of comfort that your body has found for itself in these final moments before consciousness dissolves entirely. Tomorrow, perhaps, you'll think about schedules again. You'll think about deadlines and responsibilities and all the small pressures that accumulate like frost on a January launch pad. But tonight, there's nothing to do except rest. There's nothing to be except still. The stars outside your window, can you feel them? Not with your eyes, which are closed now or growing heavy, but with something deeper, something that recognizes the ancient darkness and feels at home in it. Those stars witnessed Challenger's rise and fall, and they witnessed every shuttle launch before it, and every rocket that ever left the Earth, and every human who ever looked up in wonder and dreamed of joining them. And they'll witness tomorrow too, whatever tomorrow brings, whatever new attempts we make to reach beyond our small, fragile lives and touch something eternal. You don't need to conquer the sky tonight. You don't need to solve any problems or meet any deadlines or prove anything to anyone. The sky is just there. A dome of peace, a blanket of stars, a reminder that the universe is vast enough to hold both our achievements and our failures in the same patient star-filled darkness. And you are just here, just breathing, just slowly drifting toward the boundary between waking and sleep, where all the sharp edges soften and all the memories blur into something gentle. The lessons of Challenger float in that darkness too, not as warnings anymore, not as accusations, but as quiet companions, silent sentinels that watch over every new attempt to reach beyond what seems safe. They don't frighten me, these lessons. They comfort me, actually. They remind me that even when things go wrong, even when the margins close and the cold winds and the smoke fills the sky, there's still something noble in the attempt itself. Something worth remembering. Something worth carrying forward into whatever comes next. The lamplight is lower now, or perhaps that's just my imagination. The way the darkness seems to be winning its slow, patient battle against the light, the way the shadows are growing longer and softer and more welcoming. Your breath has found its natural rhythm, the one that belongs to dreams and not to waking thoughts. And somewhere far away beyond memory, beyond history, beyond even the long, patient silence that follows every tragedy, the 7 astronauts are still drifting, held forever in a moment that has become, over the years, not a disaster, but a quiet meditation on what it means to be human, to be brave, to reach for something beyond your grasp. Good night now. The sky is calm. The stars are watching. And you are exactly where you need to be, warm and safe, and slowly, gently, dissolving into the darkness. Sleep well, my friend. Sleep well.